21st December 1939. The Firth of Forth, Scotland. Cloud down to around 2,000 feet, the winter sea grey and corrugated beneath it. The sun sets by 3:30 this far north, and by the time two Handley Page Hampden bombers were crossing the coastline at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, the light had already flattened into that coastal winter grey that makes silhouettes of everything. The two aircraft were L4089 and L4090, both from number 44 Rhodesia Squadron, returning from an anti-shipping reconnaissance off the Norwegian coast. They'd been out over the North Sea for hours. They'd gone north and east into the cold, over water that would kill a man in minutes if he went in, looking for German naval activity, and now they were inbound. 8 miles from the Scottish coastline, close enough to see land, close enough to count as home. Bad weather had separated them from their main formation somewhere over the North Sea. Instead of the intended northeast approach to their base, they drifted south, made landfall near the Firth of Forth. Ground controllers plotted 2 unidentified aircraft tracking in from the east. The shape they saw on the plotting table was wrong. The trajectory, the approach bearing, the fact that these weren't the aircraft that were expected. At RAF Drem on the south shore of the Firth, 12 Spitfires from number 602, City of Glasgow Squadron, scrambled. One RAF unit, already airborne, correctly identified the approaching aircraft as Hampdens and radioed the identification. A second unit attacked regardless. Both bombers went into the sea. LAC Terence Gibbon, wireless operator and air gunner aboard L4090, 21 years old, drowned before rescue could reach him. His crewmates, P.O. Patrick Dingwall, Sergeant John Reed, and Sergeant William Lodge, were pulled from the water. The 4 men aboard L4089, Pilot Officer Ronald Sansom, Sergeant Edward Farrens, Sergeant Harry Moyle, and Aircraftman First Class John Little, were hauled to safety by a fishing boat. Terence Gibbon is buried at Kirkleatham, St Cuthbert Churchyard in Yorkshire. He was the first man in this story to pay with his life for a visual confusion built into the aircraft's design. Nobody on those Spitfires had acted without cause. The pilots thought they were looking at German Dornier Do 17. The twin-engine layout, the narrow fuselage, the twin tail fins at the back of a slender tail boom, in poor winter light, at angle, at speed, the silhouettes were close enough to be lethal. The Hampden looked, at a glance, like exactly the thing Britain was trying to shoot down. The man who had given the Hampden that shape was, at that precise moment, sitting in British custody. His name was Gustav Victor Lachmann. Born in Dresden, employed by Britain, chief designer of one of Britain's principal bombers, and locked up by the country he'd been building aircraft for because he was German. When those Spitfires fired on his Hampdens over the Firth of Forth, he was somewhere between a holding facility in Canada and a prison cell in Surrey. The Hampdens' true story, a German designer imprisoned, crews shot down by their own side, a fuselage so narrow it earned the name the Flying Suitcase, is stranger and more moving than anything anyone has invented about this aircraft. The honest record is sufficient. Gustav Victor Lachmann was born on the 3rd of February 1896 in Dresden, then the capital of the Kingdom of Saxony within the German Empire. His father, Gustav Anton Lachmann, was an Austrian industrialist. The family was comfortable, educated, and technically minded in the way that late 19th century German industrial families often were. Dresden was a city of manufacturing precision, of chemical works and mechanical institutes, of an ambient assumption that things could be understood and improved by careful study. When the Great War began in 1914, Lachmann was 18. He enlisted with the 24th Hessian Life Dragoons, cavalry in the old manor, and was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1916. Early in 1917, he transferred to the German Flying Corps. Pilot training. The Western Front was waiting. In August 1917, ready to deploy, he took off in a Rumpler-C reconnaissance aircraft, entered a steep banking turn, stalled, went into a spin, and hit the ground. He broke his jaw. He spent the next 6 months in hospital. Those 6 months shaped the rest of his life, and by extension shaped a British bomber, and by extension shaped the operational experience of 1,430 aircraft and thousands of crew members. The stall was the hidden executioner of the first age of powered flight. At a critical angle of incidence, the angle at which a wing meets the air flowing over it, something changes. Airflow that had been following the upper surface of the wing separates. Lift drops suddenly and catastrophically. The aircraft falls. Pilots in training, pilots in combat, pilots in the middle of maneuvers they'd performed successfully 100 times before, all of them could be taken without warning by a phenomenon they couldn't see, couldn't feel coming, and barely understood. The Germans called it Übersehen und Trudeln. The French called it La Panne Classique. Everyone called it mysterious and frequently fatal. Lying in a hospital bed with his jaw wired, Lachmann thought through the aerodynamics from first principles. What if the wing was subdivided into a series of smaller aerofoil sections, separated by curved, nozzle-shaped gaps, slots? At low angles of incidence, very little air would flow through the slots. But as the angle increased toward the stall, the slot geometry would force high-pressure air from beneath the wing up and over the upper surface, re-energizing the boundary layer, delaying the flow separation, sustaining lift at angles that would otherwise kill the pilot. He built a test rig from what was available in the hospital repair shop, a small wooden aerofoil model, a lady's hairdryer, cigarette smoke to visualize the airflow, and confirmed the reasoning while still recovering from his crash. The experiment was crude. The conclusion was correct. In February 1918, before rejoining his squadron on the Western Front, he submitted a patent application to the German Patent Office under the heading Aerofoils, whose profile consists of several separate staggered elements arranged in the form of a Venetian blind. The examiner rejected it. No independent proof that the predicted lift increase would actually occur. Lachmann went to the front. He was severely wounded in aerial combat and found himself in hospital again, corresponding with the patent examiner by letter, making the case from his bed while the war continued outside the window. The examiner remained unmoved. The war ended. The stalemate continued. Lachmann enrolled at the Technical University of Darmstadt to study mechanical engineering and aerodynamics, graduated in June 1921, took a position at the Opel factory in Rüsselsheim am Main, and then read something in the aeronautical magazine Flugsport that sent him immediately back to the patent office. Frederick Handley Page, the British aircraft manufacturer, had demonstrated a slotted wing on a modified de Havilland DH-9 at Cricklewood by October 1920. The aircraft had flown in controlled flight right at the point of stall. Handley Page had invented the leading-edge slot. Lachmann had invented the leading-edge slot. Two men on opposite sides of a world war, working separately, without knowledge of each other, had arrived at the same aerodynamic solution at roughly the same moment. The patent examiner's position became untenable. Lachmann borrowed 1,000 Deutschmarks from his mother to pay for wind tunnel tests at Ludwig Prandtl's Aerodynamic Institute in Göttingen. The results were unambiguous. a 60% increase in maximum lift coefficient with slots relative to an unslotted baseline. The patent was granted with its original priority date of February 1918. Then, in August 1921, Handley Page invited Lachmann to Berlin. As Lachmann later described it, they compared notes and test results, talked slots for hours, and were very much in agreement. Rather than spend years and money contesting each other's patents across multiple jurisdictions, they agreed to pool their rights and collaborate. Handley Page gained access to high-quality wind tunnel data from Göttingen. Lachmann gained a consultancy that provided income and ongoing research support. Each kept their domestic territory. Future development was shared. A 40-year friendship began over a table in Berlin between two men who 3 years earlier had been on opposite sides of the same war. Lachmann wasn't idle in the years between that Berlin meeting and his move to Britain. He completed his doctorate, Doctor of Engineering, in 1923, with a thesis on the slotted wing and its importance for aviation. He was appointed chief designer at the Albatros Aircraft Works at Johannisthal in the same year, designing the Albatros L72 and the twin-engined Albatros L73, an 8-passenger commercial transport. In 1926, he left Albatros for a position as technical advisor at the Ishikawa-jima Aircraft Works in Tokyo. He spent 3 years there, advising on aircraft design in Japan, while continuing his relationship with Handley Page from a distance. By the time he arrived at Handley Page's London offices in 1929, he was a significant figure in his own right, a published researcher, a patent holder, a working aircraft designer with experience across 3 countries. The Royal Aeronautical Society's account of his career, authored by John Green, traces his path precisely. From 1929 to 1932, he led aerodynamics, structures, and slot development. For the next 4 years, he was chief designer. Then he headed the research department. He joined, in 1929, as engineer in charge of slot development. In 1932, he was appointed chief designer. The chief designer years produced the HP-54 Harrow and the HP-52 Hampden. The Hampden answered Air Ministry Specification B.9/32, issued on October 20, 1932. A call for a twin-engined medium-day bomber of higher performance than anything then in service. Vickers also answered the specification. Their design became the Wellington. A third submission came from Bristol. The Air Ministry evaluated all 3 and ultimately ordered both Handley Page's design and Vickers's, because neither was clearly superior to the other in all categories. The Hampden was faster. The Wellington carried more and had greater range. Both entered service. Lachmann's HP-52 prioritized aerodynamic efficiency. The slotted flaps and leading-edge wing slots, his own invention, refined over a decade and now applied to a frontline bomber, gave the aircraft a landing speed of just 73 miles per hour despite its size. The top speed reached 263 miles per hour at altitude. That was faster than both the Wellington and the Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley, the other 2 members of what RAF planners called the trio of twin-engined medium bombers. The price for that speed was the fuselage. Reducing cross-sectional area reduced drag. The deeper the fuselage relative to its width, the more efficient the aerodynamic profile. The forward section of the Hampden was tall enough to stack 4 crew positions vertically, but barely wide enough for 1 person at a time. The trade-off between performance and habitability was made in favour of performance. In 1932, before anyone had learned what long missions over defended territory actually demanded of 4 men sealed into the same narrow tube for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch. The prototype, K4240, made its maiden flight on 21st of June 1936 at Radlett Aerodrome, Hertfordshire, flown by Chief Test Pilot Major James Cordes. When C.G. Gray, the founder of the Aeroplane magazine, saw the deep but narrow fuselage for the first time, he said it looked like a flying suitcase. The name attached itself and never let go. Aircrews would later add variations: flying panhandle for the shape of the tail boom seen from the side, and flying tadpole for the deep then narrow profile. All of them were trying to describe the same thing: an aircraft that looked assembled from components that didn't quite belong together, yet flew, by most pilot accounts, like something much more capable than it appeared. The fuselage that fooled those 602 Squadron Spitfire pilots was, for 4 men, home for every operational mission they flew. And it was a particular kind of confinement, not the discomfort of a crowded compartment, but a structural constraint that could determine whether you lived or died. External width at the narrowest point, 3 feet. 36 inches. Internal clearance was narrower still once the structural framework was accounted for. Climb in and you couldn't turn around. You couldn't walk to the man behind you. You couldn't pass him so much as a thermos flask without a contortion that would strain you in training and might be impossible at altitude in gloves with your oxygen mask on. The 4-man crew, pilot in the forward cockpit with its greenhouse canopy, navigator and bomb aimer below and behind in the nose section, radio operator in the mid-fuselage, rear gunner isolated in the tail boom, were fixed in position from wheels up to wheels down. They had no visual contact with each other, only the intercom. For the next 6, 7, 8 hours over Germany, each man existed in his own sealed world. There were 111 items for the pilot to manage alone. Instruments, engine controls, bomb switches, everything routed to the pilot's position, because there was no room to distribute it elsewhere and no practical way for another crew member to help under normal conditions. Wilfred John Lewis flew his entire first operational tour on Hampdens. His account is direct. A beautiful aeroplane to fly, terrible to fly in. Cramped, no heat, no facilities where you could relieve yourself. You got in there and you were stuck there. The aeroplane was like a fighter. It was only 3 feet wide on the outside of the fuselage, and the pilot was a very busy person. There were 111 items for the pilot to take care of. Lewis didn't romanticize it. Neither did the men who came after him and didn't come back. No heat. At altitude over Germany in January, the crew positions pushed toward the outer sections of the aircraft were exposed to temperatures that frost the instruments and numb the hands inside 3 layers of gloves. Wing Commander Charles Stenner flew 57 missions on Hampdens with 50 and 106 squadrons. When his son later documented his service, Stenner's only recorded complaint about the aircraft was that it was bloody cold at altitude. 57 missions in an aircraft with no effective heating system in the European winters of 1940 and 1941. And that was what he chose to say about it. The RAF's own training manuals attempted to address the most serious operational consequence of the narrow fuselage. What happens when the pilot is incapacitated? The documented extraction procedure required a second crew member to fold down the pilot's seat, position himself alongside the prone pilot, and physically extract the pilot's feet from the rudder pedals before taking control of the aircraft. This procedure, attempted during training exercises, caused fatal crashes. It was subsequently deleted from the training manual as too dangerous to teach.
The RAF's formal position, in effect, was that if the pilot was hit over the target, the aircraft and its remaining crew were in serious difficulty. Crew members who were wounded had to manage alone, wherever they were sitting. The memoir Bomber Boy records a Hampden crew managing to wrap a tourniquet around an injured man's arm despite the fuselage constraints, a moment presented as a notable achievement rather than a routine first aid response. In the Hampden, getting to a wounded crewmate and applying a tourniquet was a remarkable thing to have accomplished. That is the scale the fuselage imposed. No powered gun turrets, unlike the Stirling or early variants of the Halifax. The Hampden's guns were aimed by hand. Because of the geometry of the fuselage and its defensive positions, the crew couldn't effectively traverse their weapons against fighters attacking from the beam. German pilots learned this. They learned that if they positioned themselves to the side of a Hampden rather than approaching from ahead or behind, the defensive armament couldn't track them. One operational account records the tactic with stark clarity. The Germans merely came alongside and picked the Hampden crews off one by one. One observer found an improvised counter. He broke the perspex at the side of his aircraft and fired a Vickers K-gun through the gap at Messerschmitts attacking from the beam, which, by one account, put sufficient wind up them that they left. No such improvisation was standard. No such fix was built into the aircraft. The RAF responded with what it could. Single Vickers K-guns in the dorsal and ventral positions were upgraded to twin Vickers K-mounts under Air Vice Marshal Arthur Harris's direction at No. 5 Group during 1940. Armour plate was added. Flame dampers were fitted to the exhaust stacks to reduce the aircraft's visibility at night. By late 1939, Bomber Command had accepted that the Hampden couldn't survive sustained daylight operations against Luftwaffe fighters. It went to night work alongside the Wellington and the Wickley in the darkness over Germany, navigating by dead reckoning, bombing targets it often couldn't see clearly, and hoping the mathematics held. Night flying didn't solve the cold, or the isolation, or the impossibility of reaching a man 3 positions away through a fuselage not wide enough for 2 people side by side. At the outbreak of war in September 1939, the British government formally classified German-born residents as enemy aliens. Lachmann had lived in Britain for 10 years. He had designed Britain's bombers. He had worked beside Frederick Handley Page since 1929. The two men had been colleagues and friends since their meeting in Berlin in 1921, collaborators across nearly 2 decades. None of it changed his legal status. He was German. He was interned in Canada, transported across the Atlantic as a security threat under the terms that applied to enemy aliens at the outbreak of hostilities. Pressure from Handley Page secured his transfer to the Isle of Man, where he was able to work for the company as a consultant. The Royal Aeronautical Society's published history of the Handley Page Company, drawing on documented records, is straightforward on what happened. Pressure from Handley Page led to his transfer to the Isle of Man, where he was able to work for the company as a consultant. Eventually, the authorities made a further arrangement. Lachmann was housed at Lingfield Prison in Surrey and allowed to continue his design work for Handley Page from there. He was regarded with suspicion by MI5 as a possible spy. The National Archives at Kew hold files on his case in the series covering German intelligence agents and suspected agents. Whether his work from Lingfield involved correspondence with the Radlett design team, supervised visits, or some combination of arrangements, the surviving record does not fully specify.
What is documented is that the work continued and that Handley Page's advocacy was sufficient to secure the arrangement, which means the company considered him not merely useful, but essential enough to fight for. He wasn't a spy. He was the man who, in a German hospital in 1918, had reasoned out the aerodynamics of the leading-edge slot from first principles and built a test rig from a hairdryer and cigarette smoke. He was the man who had borrowed 1,000 marks from his mother to pay for the wind tunnel tests that proved the concept and forced the patent examiner's hand. He was the man who had walked into a Berlin meeting in 1921 and chosen collaboration over litigation, and who had spent the next 18 years turning that collaboration into aircraft flying for the Royal Air Force. In the winter of 1939 and into 1940, while Hampdens flew night missions over Germany, while those same aircraft's crews navigated by dead reckoning, bombed targets they couldn't always find, and came home to Lincolnshire aerodromes they could barely see in the dark, the aircraft's chief designer was in a Surrey prison, a suspected enemy, working on what he was permitted to work on, and waiting for a government that had imprisoned him to decide what to do next. The silhouette confusion that killed Terence Gibbon on December 21, 1939, deserves careful explanation, because it was structural and it came back. The Dornier DO-17 had earned its German nickname, the Fliegender Bleistift, the flying pencil, from the uniform narrowness of its fuselage from nose to tail. Twin engines on the wing leading edges, two vertical tail fins supported at the rear of twin booms extending from the wing. From directly below, or at distance in broken cloud, or approaching at an angle through poor winter visibility, a narrow central shape, wings outward, twin tails at the back. The Hampden's forward fuselage was deep, the crew stacked vertically in that tall, slab-sided forward section, and then narrowed sharply into a very slender tail boom extending rearward. Same twin-engine arrangement on the wings, same twin-fin configuration at the tail, the fins mounted at the end of that distinctive slim rear section. The Hampden's wingspan was 21.1 metres, the Do-17's approximately 18 metres. Both were twin-engined medium bombers. Both had the twin-tail silhouette that distinguished them from single-fin types. The visual confusion was compounded by a shared design philosophy of the same period. The Hampden's defensive layout, guns concentrated forward with limited lateral coverage, mirrored the cockpit thinking then being adopted in Luftwaffe medium bombers. The silhouettes didn't match precisely, but they matched sufficiently. Aviation safety records for the 21st December incident state directly that the aircraft were misidentified as Dornier DO-17s, which have a similar layout, twin engines, narrow fuselage, twin tail fins. Recognition was hardest when the aircraft wasn't flying level toward the observer, when it was banking or at angle or silhouetted against broken cloud, and the deep then narrow Hampden fuselage compressed into a shape indistinguishable from the Dornier's pencil outline. Pilots who encountered the confusion in real time testified to it. One 602 Squadron pilot acknowledged he had considered that the approaching aircraft might be Hampden's, but had taken the profile he saw, at angle, for a Dornier turning away. The identification is hardest in those last few seconds of uncertainty, when the image the brain is processing is a silhouette at an angle in poor light, and the decision has to be made. The problem wasn't resolved by the December 1939 incident. On November 14, 1940, nearly 11 months later, a Hampden of 61 Squadron was attacked by 3 Spitfires during an operational flight. The incident was documented. The recognition guides, the training updates, the visible cost of the earlier event, none of it was sufficient to eliminate a confusion that was ultimately built into the aircraft's shape. Lachmann hadn't designed the Hampden to look like a Dornier. He designed it to be fast. The aerodynamic choices that produced that speed produced a silhouette that, at the wrong angle, in the wrong light, read as the enemy. The Hampden entered RAF service with No. 49 Squadron at RAF Scampton in September 1938. Over the following 4 years, the squadrons that flew it compiled a record that the aircraft's ungainly appearance has made it difficult to honour properly. On the 19th of March 1940, Hampdens took part in the first deliberate British bombing of German soil. A night raid on seaplane hangars and slipways at Hornum on the island of Sylt. From April 1940, they flew the first mine-laying operations in the North Sea, which Bomber Command's own assessment rated as highly effective, with a loss rate of less than 1.9 aircraft per mission. On August 25, 1940, Hampdens from multiple squadrons flew in the first RAF bombing raid on Berlin. On the night of 30/31 May 1942, they were present in the first 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne. The type accumulated firsts that have mostly been folded into Lancaster mythology. Sergeant John Hanna was 18 years old on the night of September 15, 1940. Flying as wireless operator and air gunner aboard Hampden P1355 of No. 83 Squadron, bound for Antwerp. A bomb hit set the aircraft on fire in flight. 2 crew members bailed out. Pilot Officer C.A. Connor stayed at the controls. Hanna stayed inside the burning aircraft. He fought the fire with his hands, pulling burning material away from structural components, throwing it overboard, working in the heat and the smoke until the flames were out and the aircraft was flyable again. His hands were burned. Connor flew the aircraft home to its base. The London Gazette published Hanna's Victoria Cross citation on October 1, 1940. At the time of the award, he was the youngest airman in the Royal Air Force to receive the Victoria Cross in World War II. John Hanna died on the 7th of June 1947 from tuberculosis, aged 25. Flight Lieutenant Roderick Learoyd of No. 49 Squadron received the Victoria Cross for a low-level attack on the Dortmund-Ems Canal on August 12, 1940. He pressed home his bombing run at minimum altitude through sustained anti-aircraft fire, after watching the aircraft ahead of him take hits, while 2 of the 5 Hampdens dispatched on that operation failed to return. He brought his aircraft home with heavy damage. Guy Gibson began his operational career in No. 83 Squadron at the outbreak of war, flying Hampdens from Scampton. He completed 30 sorties and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, gazetted on the 8th of July 1940. In April 1940, he was laying mines in the North Sea from a Hampden cockpit, describing the work in his memoir Enemy Coast Ahead as methodical, solitary, and conducted in the particular silence of a bomber flying singly over water at night. He describes dive-bombing attacks on Kiel Harbour in the same aircraft, in the same cramped fuselage, in the same 3-foot-wide cockpit environment that every other 83 Squadron crew inhabited. Gibson later flew Manchesters, then Lancasters, then led 617 Squadron's Dambuster raid in May 1943. His trajectory as a wartime pilot began in the aircraft C.G. Gray had called a flying suitcase.
Wing Commander John Sherwood flew 30 sorties on Hampdens in the summer of 1940 and earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the sustained campaign against German invasion barge concentrations in Channel ports, what Gibson called the Battle of the Barges. Sherwood's documented missions included a flight of 600 miles in broad daylight, no fighter escort, at less than 250 feet altitude to stay below German radar. 600 miles at low level, in broad daylight, through defended airspace, inside a fuselage not wide enough for two people to stand side by side. He later flew Manchesters and Lancasters, was shot down over Augsburg on April 17, 1942 during Operation Margin, was presumed dead for 6 weeks, then surfaced as a prisoner at Stalag Luft 3, where he witnessed the wooden horse escape and subsequently the Great Escape. He survived the war. These are Hampden men. They aren't remembered the way Lancaster crews are remembered, or Spitfire pilots. The aircraft didn't photograph heroically. It looked, as Gray noted, like luggage. The production numbers are verifiable and should be stated plainly. Total Hampdens built across all manufacturers, Handley Page at Radlett, English Electric at Preston, and Canadian Associated Aircraft, reached 1,430. English Electric alone built 770, more than any other single facility, before delivering its last aircraft on March 15, 1942. Handley Page had terminated its own production line in July 1940 after completing its 500th aircraft. Canadian production, which had risen to 15 aircraft per month by October 1940, delivered its final example in late 1941. 3 countries built this aircraft, designed by a German in a British office in the 1930s, and all 1,430 of them flew for Allied air forces. Of the 1,430 built, 714 were lost on operations. 1,077 crew members were killed. Another 739 were listed as missing, which in most cases meant the aircraft went into the sea or the ground without trace or survivors. German flak accounted for 108 of those losses. Luftwaffe fighters claimed 128, shooting down 92 of them at night. 263 were listed as lost to a variety of causes. 214 were simply missing. 714 out of 1,430, just under half of every Hampden built, didn't come home. Bomber Command as a whole lost 55,573 aircrew killed, from 125,000 who served, a death rate of 44.4%. The Imperial War Museum's assessment is stark. Of every 100 Bomber Command aircrew, 55 were killed on operations or died of wounds. 12 became prisoners of war, 2 evaded capture, and only 27 survived a full operational tour unscathed. Hampden crews were inside those numbers throughout. Their losses helped compile them. By late 1941, the casualty rate had grown severe enough that Hampdens were restricted to night operations entirely. Additional armour was fitted. The twin Vickers K upgrades were standard. None of it addressed the fundamental problem, which was that the aircraft had been designed in 1932 to a specification written before anyone understood what a European air war would actually demand of a twin-engined medium bomber flying long distances without fighter escort into defended airspace. By late 1942, 4-engined heavies,
Avro Lancasters, Handley Page Halifaxes were replacing twin-engine types at the heavy squadrons of No. 5 Group. The last Hampden sorties flown by Bomber Command were by 408 Squadron, RCAF, against Wilhelmshaven on the night of the 14th to 15th of September 1942. The aircraft's time in the main bombing force was over. But the aircraft had one more role in it. In April 1942, No. 144 Squadron, RAF, transferred from Bomber Command to Coastal Command. No. 455 Squadron, RAAF, followed on April 27th, the first Australian squadron to join RAF Bomber Command's No. 5 Group, now transitioning to a different kind of war. The aircraft was redesignated the Hampden TB Mark I torpedo bomber. The bomb bay was reconfigured to carry a single 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo internally in an open bay, the nose of the weapon protruding beyond the aircraft's belly. 2 500-pound bombs could be carried under each wing as an alternative or supplementary load. A total of 144 Hampdens were converted to this configuration. Crews moved to RAF Lucas in Fife, Scotland, and relearned their trade. The bombing missions over Germany, night, altitude, navigating to a fixed target, had given way to something different. Low-level daylight runs against German merchant convoys and naval escorts operating along the Norwegian coast, crossing into kill range at minimum altitude to launch torpedoes at close quarters against ships that were shooting back with everything they had. The aircraft that couldn't survive sustained daylight operations over Germany because of its defensive limitations was now being used for daylight work at low level against defended shipping. The crews went anyway. On the 28th of January 1943, 7 aircraft from 455 and 489 squadrons combined to sink a 3,570-ton German merchant vessel with torpedoes, the first confirmed torpedo kill for the Hampden force. More followed through the spring of 1943. On the 12th of May, a 6,018-ton merchantman went down near Egero Island off the Norwegian coast. On May 15th, an 8,000-ton tanker was hit and left ablaze. On June 19th, a 2,500-ton merchant ship was struck amidships and left burning. On the 30th of April 1943, a 455 Squadron Hampden, crewed by Flight Sergeant J.S. Firth, caught U-227 surfaced in the Norwegian Sea north of the Faroe Islands at position 64.05 degrees north, 06.40 degrees west. U-227 was a 789-ton Type 7C submarine under 25-year-old Kapitanleutnant Jürgen Kuntz on her first war patrol. Firth attacked twice, accurately dropping 8 depth charges that straddled the hull. The crew watched U-227 halt and slide stern first below the surface. They counted at least 30 survivors in the water. No immediate decoration was awarded for the sinking. 455 Squadron's complete operational record across 25 months of Hampden flying covered 1,152 sorties. 9 merchant vessels sunk, 1 submarine destroyed, 6 merchant ships and 2 submarines heavily damaged, 1 enemy aircraft destroyed and 4 damaged. 50 Hampdens lost, 68 aircrew killed in action, 7 taken prisoner. The operation that most precisely captures both the capability and the cost of the Hampden torpedo force took place on the 4th of September 1942. 32 Hampden TB Mark I torpedo bombers took off from Sombra in the Shetland Islands. 16 were from number 144 Squadron RAF, 16 from number 455 Squadron RAAF. Their destination was Vaenga, a Soviet naval airfield on the Kola Inlet, 40 kilometers north of Murmansk in the Russian Arctic. Their mission: to position at Vaenga and provide torpedo bomber cover for Arctic convoy PQ-18, protecting it from German surface vessels, including the battleship Tirpitz, which had been sortying from Norwegian fjords throughout 1942. The route covered approximately 3,900 kilometers, nearly 2,100 nautical miles, partly over open water, partly over enemy-occupied Norway and Finland. The crews flew without fighter escort. They navigated by dead reckoning across featureless ocean and hostile coastline, at altitudes low enough to stay out of radar coverage when possible, aware that Luftwaffe units based in Norway were watching the same skies. The weather over the route was poor in the way the Norwegian and Barents Seas are poor in September. Cloud, wind, icing at altitude, visibility that came and went without warning. 8 of the 32 Hampdens were lost en route, or damaged beyond repair before they reached Soviet territory. 25% of the entire force before a single torpedo was launched. 8 aircraft, 32 crew members at 4 per aircraft. The transit itself cost a quarter of the operation. The surviving aircraft and crews arrived at Vaenga and flew a small number of sorties from the Soviet airfield before a second problem emerged. The prevailing westerly headwinds across the return route were strong enough to push the fuel requirement beyond what the Hampdens' tanks could carry. The aircraft didn't have the range to fly back to Scotland against those headwinds. The British and Australian crews wouldn't be flying their aircraft home. What followed was methodical and unusual. The RAF and RAAF personnel spent the next several weeks at Vaenga training Soviet naval air crews on the Hampdens' systems, its instruments, its torpedo equipment, its handling characteristics. The aircraft were formally transferred to the Soviet Navy's 24th Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment. The British and Australian crews shipped home from Murmansk as passengers. The Soviets called the aircraft the Balalaika after its shape and flew them operationally until mid-1943, when combat losses and the unavailability of British specification spare parts forced the regiment to retire the type and revert to its Ilyushin DB-3s. 455 Squadron was re-equipped with fresh Hampdens and resumed operations from Lucas in December 1942. The Torpedo Hampden continued flying Norwegian coastal patrols until December 10, 1943, when the last Coastal Command Squadron transitioned from the type. It was replaced by the Bristol Beaufighter, a faster, better-armed, twin-engined strike aircraft that could do what the Hampden had done and do it with a better chance of the crew surviving. By that point, the Hampden had been out of Handley Page's production line for 3 years. After the war, Lachman returned to Handley Page as head of the research department. He remained there for the rest of his working life. The work he led in the 1950s shifted away from conventional aircraft design toward boundary layer control, using surface suction through porous wing skins to maintain laminar airflow and reduce drag. It was the same fundamental question he'd been working on since 1918. How does air behave at the boundary of a wing surface? And how can that behavior be made to work in the pilot's favor rather than against him? The scale changed. The methods changed. The question remained. He collaborated with his deputy, Godfrey Lee, on the crescent-shaped swept wing for the Handley Page HP-80 Victor, the 4-engined jet bomber that entered RAF service in 1958 and carried Britain's nuclear deterrent through the Cold War.
The aerodynamic research that Lachman and Lee developed on boundary layer behaviour and laminar flow control fed into lines of research that the Royal Aeronautical Society's published account of Handley Page history traces explicitly forward toward the technical lineages that contributed to Concorde. The man who had invented the leading-edge slot in a German hospital in 1918 helped lay technical foundations that ran forward into supersonic civil aviation. He became a British citizen on April 28, 1949. He had been imprisoned as a suspected German spy in 1939. 10 years later, the country that had locked him up gave him a British passport. He accepted it. He stayed at Handley Page until 1965, 5 months before his death. He retired as head of research. Handley Page Limited itself went into liquidation in 1970. In July 1964, 2 years after Frederick Handley Page's death, Lachman stood at the Royal Aeronautical Society and delivered the second Handley Page Memorial Lecture, an address in honour of the man who had invited him to Berlin in 1921, hired him to London in 1929, and worked alongside him for over 3 decades. His opening words, as preserved in the published record of the lecture, paid tribute to a great Englishman and aeronautical pioneer who for 40 years had been his personal friend and, for over 30, his chief. The man who, more than any other, had decisively influenced the course of his life. A German-born engineer, imprisoned by the British government as a suspected spy, delivering the memorial lecture for the Englishman who had employed him before the Royal Aeronautical Society in London. He held no apparent public grudge. He kept working. He became British. Gustav Victor Lachman died in Chorleywood, Hertfordshire, on 30 May 1966. He was 70 years old. The leading-edge slots he invented, in a hospital bed, from a hairdryer and cigarette smoke, while a patent examiner refused his application, are standard equipment on every commercial aircraft flying anywhere in the world today. The complete record of the Handley Page Hampden doesn't require embellishment. 1,430 built, 714 lost on operations, 1,077 crew killed, 739 missing. A fuselage 36 inches wide, a designer imprisoned for being German while his aircraft flew over the country that imprisoned him. An aircraft so similar in silhouette to a Dornier Deo 17 that its own Spitfires shot it down over Scotland in December 1939, and fired on it again 11 months later. And the problem was never fully resolved. Crews sealed into individual compartments for 6-hour missions over Germany, unable to reach a wounded man 3 positions away, unable to turn around in the space they occupied, flying anyway. Men who lost a quarter of their force getting to Murmansk on a transit flight handed their aircraft to the Soviet Navy because the headwinds wouldn't let them fly home, and came back by ship. That is the Hampden. That's the honest account. Somewhere in those numbers is someone you might know. If your grandfather flew Hampdens, his name, his squadron, the code letters on his aircraft, what he told you about those missions, or what he never told you at all, leave it in the comments. If your father did, if your uncle, if it's someone whose service record you've been piecing together for years from logbooks and medal cards and things found in a drawer after a funeral. The official record can give us the loss figures and the operation dates and the aircraft serial numbers. Only you can tell us who those men actually were. Their stories belong here, and we want to hear them. Subscribe for more stories like this.